A spacecraft comes home from the moon. It slams into the atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour. Temperatures on the outside reach 5,000 degrees, half as hot as the surface of the sun. The capsule splashes down safely in the Pacific Ocean. Navy divers swim out and pull it from the water. They flip it over, and they look at the bottom and they stop, because the bottom of that spacecraft looks like somebody took a blowtorch to a birthday cake. Chunks of the protective coating are gone. Cracks run through the charred surface. Pieces that should still be there are missing, and nobody predicted it. Nobody's computer model said that would happen. Now the spacecraft survived. Everything inside was fine. If astronauts had been aboard, they would not have even felt anything wrong. The temperatures inside stayed well within the design limits. But the outside of the shield, the part that was supposed to erode in a controlled, predictable, well-understood way, it eroded in a way that was none of those things. And that is a problem, because predictability is everything when you are putting people behind a shield. So you have got the most advanced spacecraft ever built with the best thermal protection money can buy, and it comes back from an unmanned test flight around the moon looking like it survived something it barely understood. And the question everybody should be asking is not why did those chunks fall off? That is a good question, and we will get to it. The question you should be asking first is much more basic, much more physical. The question is, why is coming home from the moon so much worse than coming home from orbit? Because astronauts come home from orbit all the time. They ride down from the space station, they experience some heating, they pop their parachutes, they splash down, everybody claps, the end. Coming back from the moon should just be the same thing, only a little farther away. Right? Wrong. Completely, deeply, fundamentally wrong. And the reason it is wrong tells you something beautiful about how energy works. Something that a lot of people, even smart people, do not quite appreciate until you lay it out for them. So let us start with something simple. What does it mean to be in orbit? You are going around the Earth at about 17,500 miles per hour. That is roughly 8 kilometers per second. You are going sideways so fast that the Earth curves away beneath you at the same rate you fall toward it. That is, all orbit is perpetual falling with enough sideways speed that you never hit the ground. Good. When you want to come home from orbit, you fire your engines backward. You slow down by maybe 200 miles per hour. That is enough. That tiny reduction drops your orbit just enough that you start kissing the upper atmosphere. The air begins to thicken. You begin to decelerate. And over the next several minutes, you go from 17,500 miles per hour down to a few hundred. The air does most of the work. Your heat shield gets hot. Yes, maybe 3,000 degrees, and that is serious. But the energy involved is manageable. The systems we have built to handle orbital reentry are mature and well tested. When you come home from the moon, you do not arrive at 17,500 miles per hour. You arrive at 25,000 miles per hour, about 11 kilometers per second. You might think, well, that is only about 40% faster. Surely the heating is only about 40% worse. And this is where people get fooled. Because heating during reentry does not scale linearly with speed. It does not even scale with the square of the speed. The aerodynamic heating rate scales roughly with the cube of velocity. Some analyses put it even higher, around velocity to the power of 3.15. Let me say that plainly. If you go 40% faster, the heating is not 40% worse. It is roughly 2.7 times worse, nearly 3 times the punishment on the heat shield, 3 times the energy per second being dumped into that surface. And the total heat load depends on how long you spend in the hot zone, which depends on your trajectory, which depends on your speed. Let me put it differently. Kinetic energy goes as velocity squared. If you are returning from orbit at 17,500 miles per hour, and from the moon at 25,000 miles per hour, the ratio of kinetic energies is 25,000 squared divided by 17,500 squared. That is about 2. So the total energy you need to dump into the atmosphere is roughly double. But the rate at which that energy arrives at the heat shield surface, the heating rate, goes as the cube of velocity. So the instantaneous punishment is nearly triple. You have twice the total energy to dispose of, but it arrives at the shield 3 times as fast per unit area. This combination is what makes lunar return a qualitatively different problem. It is not the same problem turned up a notch, it is a different problem. In engineering, we sometimes say that a change in quantity becomes a change in kind. When you heat water from 20 degrees to 60 degrees, you just have warmer water. But when you heat it from 90 degrees to 110 degrees, you do not have hotter water. You have steam. The physics changed character. The same thing happens between orbital reentry and lunar reentry. The shield is no longer just managing heat. It is engaged in a violent chemical and physical negotiation with a plasma that wants to destroy it. So the difference between orbit and lunar return is not a gentle slope. It is a cliff. You cross a threshold where the physics changes character. Below that threshold, you are managing heat. Above it, you are in a fight with it. And it gets worse. If you start thinking about coming home from Mars someday, the re-entry speed goes up to about 14 kilometers per second instead of 11. That does not sound like much more, does it? But remember the cubic scaling. 14 over 11 cubed is about 2.1. So the heating from Mars return is roughly double the heating from lunar return, which is already roughly triple the heating from orbital return. You start to see how quickly this problem grows. Small changes in velocity create enormous changes in what the shield must endure. This is not a linear world. This is a world where the physics punishes you exponentially for going faster. Let me give you an analogy that has nothing to do with clocks or trains. Think about holding your hand near a campfire. At 2 feet away, it is warm, pleasant. Move to 1 foot away, it is hot, uncomfortable, but you can take it. Move to 6 inches away, and suddenly you cannot hold your hand there for more than a second. The increase was gradual in distance, but the pain went up like a wall. That is what the velocity-cubed relationship does. Small changes in speed create enormous changes in what the heat shield has to survive. All right. So the heating is much more intense when you return from the moon. But there is another piece of this puzzle that people overlook, and it has to do with the corridor, the re-entry corridor. Imagine you are driving on a highway at 60 miles per hour, and you have to exit through a gap in the guardrail. If the gap is 100 feet wide, no problem. You steer through it easily. If the gap is 10 feet wide, you had better be paying attention. If the gap is 3 inches wide, you are in serious trouble. When a spacecraft returns from orbit, the re-entry corridor, the range of acceptable angles at which you can enter the atmosphere, is relatively generous. You have some margin. Enter a little too steep and you pull more g-forces, but you survive. Enter a little too shallow and you skip a bit. But the atmosphere catches you eventually. The corridor, the window of acceptable entry angles, is measured in degrees, and you have some room to work with. When you return from the moon, that corridor shrinks dramatically. The physics squeezes it down. One writer described it this way: if you scaled the Earth down to the size of a basketball and the moon to the size of a baseball and placed them at their correct relative distance, about 22 feet apart, the re-entry target, the band of atmosphere you must hit, would be no thicker than a sheet of paper. A sheet of paper from 22 feet away. That is your target. Come in too steep, and the deceleration will destroy the spacecraft or kill the crew with g-forces. The Apollo capsule could only tolerate about 10 g-forces before structural failure, and the crew could tolerate maybe 8 before blackout. Come in too shallow and you skip off the atmosphere entirely and sail back into space, and if you skip off, you do not get a second chance. You will not have enough fuel to come around and try again. You will simply drift away. Every single Apollo crew did it. 9 times they returned from lunar distance. 9 times they hit that paper-thin target. Think about that. In the 18th century, getting a balloon to carry a person across a town was considered a marvel. And then these engineers figured out how to thread a needle from 250,000 miles away at Mach 32. 9 for 9. It is one of the great unsung achievements in all of engineering. But here is what I want you to understand. Threading the needle is just the beginning of the problem. Because once you are inside the atmosphere, now you have to deal with what happens to the air. At 25,000 miles per hour, you do not gently push air aside. The air cannot get out of the way fast enough. It piles up in front of the spacecraft and compresses violently. We are not talking about friction here, not in the usual sense of rubbing 2 surfaces together. People say friction heats the spacecraft, and that is a common shorthand, but it is misleading. What actually happens is compression. You have felt this in your own life? Imagine taking a bicycle pump and squeezing the handle very fast. Feel the bottom of the pump after a few hard strokes. It is warm. That is compression heating. At a very small scale, the air inside the pump had nowhere to go, and the pressure rise increased its temperature. Now multiply that effect by a factor of millions, and you begin to approach what happens in front of a spacecraft at reentry speeds. The air compresses so violently that it heats to temperatures of 5,000, sometimes 10,000 degrees. The gas in front of the spacecraft gets hotter than the surface of the sun. At those temperatures, the gas is not really gas anymore. It is plasma. The molecules of nitrogen and oxygen get ripped apart. Electrons get stripped off their atoms. The air itself becomes a glowing, electrically conducting ionized sheath wrapped around the front of the capsule. And this is where something eerie happens. That plasma blocks radio signals completely when the capsule is in the thickest part of the heating, surrounded by this plasma cocoon. The astronauts go silent. Mission control loses all contact. No voice, no telemetry, no heartbeats, nothing. For several minutes on the way down, the crew is utterly, completely alone. There is another subtlety that I think is underappreciated, and it has to do with how the gas behaves at these temperatures. When you learn about gases in school, you learn about what we call an ideal gas. The molecules are independent little particles bouncing around, and the pressure and temperature and volume are related by a simple formula. That model works beautifully for air at normal conditions. But at 5,000 degrees or 10,000 degrees, air is not an ideal gas anymore. The nitrogen molecules dissociate. They break apart into individual nitrogen atoms. The oxygen molecules dissociate too. And then the atoms start losing electrons. They ionize. And when you have a gas that is partially dissociated and partially ionized, its behavior is radically different from what the simple gas laws predict. This is what physicists call real gas effects. Real gas effects change everything about the flow around the spacecraft. They shriek. They change the density of the shock layer. They change the speed of sound in the gas. They change the distribution of heat between the gas and the surface. They even change the aerodynamic forces on the spacecraft, which means they change the spacecraft's trim angle, the angle at which it naturally flies through the air. Both the Apollo capsule and the space shuttle were designed using pitching moment calculations that turned out to be wrong because the real gas effects had not been modeled correctly. For Apollo, the actual trim angle of attack was higher than the designers predicted, which meant the re-entry corridor was narrower than they thought. They got away with it because they had enough margin. But it is sobering to realize that even the Apollo engineers, the best in the business, had their models surprised by the real gas physics. On the first flight of the space shuttle Columbia, the astronauts had some anxious moments during re-entry, when the vehicle did not handle exactly as expected. And the reason turned out to be the same. Real gas effects shifting the aerodynamic center of pressure to a location different from what had been calculated. So the air itself becomes an unreliable partner. You think you know what it will do, and then it ionizes and dissociates and starts obeying different rules. Your wind tunnel tests, which were done at lower speeds with air that behaves itself, do not capture this. Your computer models, if they use simplified gas physics, do not capture it either. You need very sophisticated computational fluid dynamics codes that track the chemical reactions happening in the gas in front of the spacecraft, molecule by molecule, reaction by reaction. And even those codes have uncertainties because some of the reaction rates at these extreme conditions have never been measured in a laboratory. They are extrapolated. One of the astronauts on the upcoming mission said something about the radio blackout that I find quite moving. He said he hoped all 8 billion people in the world would come together and just be hoping and praying during the moment when the signal comes back, because until you hear that signal, you do not know. So now you have this plasma, thousands of degrees, wrapped around the bottom of the spacecraft, and you need something between that plasma and the astronauts. That something is the heat shield. And the way the heat shield works, the way it has always worked since the very first capsules, is a trick that I find absolutely delightful because it is so counterintuitive. You do not try to build a shield that reflects all that heat. You cannot. At these temperatures, no reflective surface would survive. You do not try to build something that just sits there and absorbs it either. There is too much energy for any passive insulator to handle. Instead, you build the shield out of material that is designed to be destroyed. It burns away, it melts, it vaporizes, and as it does, it carries the heat away with it. The material sacrifices itself, and in doing so, it protects what is behind it. This process has a lovely name, ablation, from the Latin ablatus, meaning carried away. It is the same word root that gives us a blade in medicine, where you destroy tissue to treat a disease. The shield treats the heat by destroying itself. The physics of ablation is gorgeous, and I want you to see why. The ablative material, when it gets hot enough, undergoes pyrolysis. That is a chemical decomposition driven by heat. The complex polymer molecules in the coating break apart into simpler, lighter molecules. Many of these lighter molecules are gases. This gas seeps outward through the porous structure of the material toward the plasma, and as it does, it creates a thin boundary layer between the plasma and the solid surface. That layer of outgassing creates what engineers call a blowing effect. It is a buffer. The gas coming off the shield pushes against the hot plasma, and this reduces the convective heat flux reaching the spacecraft by a significant fraction. But it gets better. In some ablative formulations, particularly those containing carbon, the gases released by pyrolysis introduce carbon particles into the boundary layer. These carbon particles make the gas optically opaque, meaning they block radiative heat transfer. At extreme temperatures, a large fraction of the heat comes not from hot gas touching the surface, but from the plasma radiating energy like a white-hot furnace. And the carbon in the ablation products creates a screen against that radiation. It is like the shield puts on a pair of sunglasses made of its own vaporized body. So the ablative shield is simultaneously a structural barrier, a chemical reactor, a convective insulator through the blowing effect, and a radiation shield through optical opacity, all by the elegant mechanism of controlled self-destruction. I do not know about you, but I think that is one of the more beautiful pieces of applied physics that human beings have ever devised. The material used on the Orion spacecraft is called avcoat. It is the same basic formulation that protected the Apollo astronauts. Silica fibers mixed with an epoxy novolac resin. The silica fibers provide structural strength. The epoxy resin, when it decomposes, produces the gases that create the protective boundary layer. The whole mixture is placed into a honeycomb support structure. In the original Apollo shields, there were about 330,000 tiny honeycomb cells. Each one was individually filled by a technician with a pressure gun. 6 months to fill a single heat shield. Think about that. 6 months of painstaking cell-by-cell work for something that will be used once and destroyed. That is craftsmanship of a kind most people never hear about. For the modern Orion shield, they switched to a block configuration. About 180 preformed blocks of avcoat bonded to the heat shield surface. More consistent, more manufacturable, same basic material. When Orion went around the moon on its first uncrewed test flight and came roaring back at 25,000 miles per hour, the avcoat was supposed to ablate, char, and protect the capsule. The temperatures on the exterior reached about 5,000 degrees, and the shield did protect the capsule. The temperatures inside remained within safe limits. Nobody would have been harmed. That much is important, and it should not be forgotten. But when they pulled the capsule out of the water and inspected it, the ablation pattern was wrong. The charring was uneven. Chunks of material were missing in ways the models had not predicted.